Incredible. For the second segment, what we would like to do is to have you go into the examples that you provide in your book, which is Honi HaMe'agel, which is a story that you zoom in on to bring to life these ideas that you were mentioning before in the previous segment, and Euthyphro with apology. If you can sort of give us an overview and kind of get into that to...
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So one of the stories that I talk about, which will be familiar to your listeners, is the story of Honi HaMe'agel, Honi the circle drawer. And this story occurs before the Rabbinic period, during the time of the Sanhedrin. There is the head of the Sanhedrin is a guy named Shimon ben Shetach. Who's an important sage who is devoted to the law and to following the law. There's actually a famous story about Shimon. He sees a guy go into a house with a knife. The guy comes out of the house 2 minutes later, covered with blood. The knife is covered with blood. He goes in the house. He finds someone dead. He's been stabbed. But what can Shimon do? Because the law is you got to have 2 witnesses to a crime. And I could multiply examples, but he's sort of very rationalistic. This is what the law does. We abide by the law. He also he's strictly devoted to the law, but he also has a kind of proto-rabbinic understanding. How do you earn merit? You earn merit through study, right? You earn merit through this, devotion to unpacking law and debating and understanding it. Now, this Honi character doesn't quite fit that paradigm, and I should back up, because this is in the context of a discussion in Ta'anit, which raises questions about how can we tell when something is a curse or a blessing? How can we tell who is deserving and who is not? These are sort of general issues in the air. And the context here is there's a drought. A drought's going on. The rabbis have prayed. They prayed for rain. A natural way to interpret this is that, God is punishing the people because of some perhaps unknown or unspecified sin, and God won't bring rain. Because, of course, we read over and over again in the Hebrew scriptures that, if you, walk in my ways, adhere to the law and so forth, you're going to get rain, you're going to get food, and otherwise, no. So the story is told in various ways. It's told in the Mishnah, it's told in the Gemara. In one case, I think the disciples come to Honi because he's got these disciples. And in another case, I think the people come to him directly. But in any case, they know that Honi has the capacity he's got some kind of direct line to God, and he can sort of work what looks like miracles. And by the way, miracles is another big theme in this section of Ta'anit, which is a real interest to Rabbinic Judaism, because miracles are these, unforeseen interventions into sort of the rational order of the world, and it presents a problem. Like, why would there be miracles? For example, if there are miracles, is that a sort of implicit admission that the world wasn't set up right at the beginning? That there has to be this intervention at this point. Yeah. So how do we understand miracles? So that's a whole nother set of issues. But anyway, Honi comes in and he begins behaving in a very strange way. He draws a circle around himself and he talks directly to God, and he says, I'm not going to leave this circle until you give me rain. Like, what? And sure enough, little drops start coming down, tiny little mists, not very much, And then Honi says, I didn't ask for this. That's not rain. And what rain? And then the rabbis report, drops like the size of an orange start coming down. I mean, they're just huge. They just inundate, right? And meanwhile, the disciples or the people are standing there looking on, and they're like, and they're depicted, by the way, as fearful children. In fact, they refer to Honi as well, actually, I think in the first story, it's actually children who go to him and say, my father, bring rain. And Honi says something like, these kids don't understand, that it's the Father in heaven who brings rain, not me, right? But they sort of treat him as this. And there's a suggestion throughout that, in which he sort of confirms, and what he says, that the people don't, that they're very childish, and they're sort of incapable of thinking, even sort of thinking for themselves. So anyway, all this rain comes down, and people freak out. They're like, "Uh-oh, now we're going to drown," right? And Honi's like, it's sort of a Goldilocks story, right? He's like, I didn't ask for a flood, So, and then the right amount of rain comes, right? Now, Shimon ben Shetach has been watching all this, and he says to him something like, if you weren't Honi, I would decree a ban on you. Now, what does that mean? It sort of expresses this perplexity, because here's Honi. He's not a sage. The Gemara, by the way, sort of tries to turn him into a sage, but he's not a sage. He's got some special relationship to God. He actually says at one point that to God, he's like a son of his house, right? And he behaves in a way that is very unfitting, according to Shimon's lights. And to say, if you weren't Honi, I'd decree a ban on you. And by the way, Shimon is well known, this is part of his rationalism, for having executed like 80 witches in Ashkelon. Yeah. He doesn't like, he's very suspicious of people who look like miracle workers or harnessing, mysterious powers and so forth. He's no friend of mysterious powers. So when he says, I would decree a ban on you, like, how far does that go? I mean, this is a dangerous thing. But then he says, if you weren't Honi, and I think what that means is like, you got results, right? And ultimately, I have to acknowledge I'm expanding.
He's stuck.
Yeah.
He's stuck.
Yeah.
But he also didn't get the right amount. That's the thing.
Well, eventually he did.
Eventually, but it took time. It's not like a
Right. So I mean, I think it's an acknowledgement that I could sort of sum it up this way. You have a special relationship to God that I do not exactly comprehend. Because Shimon goes on and says, you behave like a spoiled child. You behave like a spoiled child. One doesn't talk to God this way. One doesn't make demands this way. And he's fundamentally perplexed about what to do about this, because it challenges his entire rational framework. He represents a text-based system of law that's rational and teachable. As I said, there are other rabbis who are associated with the capacity. For example, Rabbi Eliezer in the Oven of Akhnai story, just to give one example, who has some kind of capacity, has the ear of God, let's say, and can perform certain sorts of miraculous actions. But Rabbi Eliezer has his powers because he is the best student of Torah, around. Like, he has earned that merit. He has proven it. Honi has not. Why is this guy who's so importunate and who doesn't have any of the capabilities that you would ordinarily associate with what we believe produces merit in the eyes of God? Remember, I said it, who is meritorious and who is not. So he kind of shakes up Shimon's worldview. Why is this the case? Yeah, please.
You have an interesting footnote just before you go on with this, because you're going to take it to a lot of places, but I wanted to just, this tension that you mentioned, you bring Safrai, I don't know how to mention his name. Who's that guy? Safrai, which basically wants to put Honi into the Hasidic camp. Not when we say Hasidic, we mean the Hasidim Rishonim of the Talmud. And he has an interesting. I was just hoping you can just tell a little bit about that view.
Do you happen to have that footnote?
Yeah, it's page 82, footnote 11.
All right, I'm going to have to reacquaint myself. Yes, Francis. Yeah. Yeah, so we've got these Hasidic charismatics. I guess this is a surprise phrase. Surprise phrase. Um, uh, and so these are these kind of miracle workers, a kind of
Pietists.
yes, they are pietists. Who valued deeds more than study, and whose actions displayed confidence in providence and in the salvation resulting from right behavior, and even in the miracles which were to be revealed to them, according to Socrates. So Honi is sort of a representative of this group. And what is suggested here is that the story reflects this uneasy relationship between these Hasidic charismatics and these Pharisaic sages like Shimon ben Shetach. What's interesting... Yeah,
that's really interesting, because in yeshiva, it's no one really puts like a barrier between the Chassidim Rishonim and the sages. They're kind of just put all together in one lump. It's just like, maybe a more devotional aspect within the sages, or
you mentioned that the Gemara tries to make Honi into kind of a rabbi, but he's not.
So no, that would actually go against what he's saying here. But I think that you mentioned in your book that the Gemara is when the Gemara interjects within the story, it's framing it a little bit differently than the Mishnah. So there's a little bit, okay. So you'll.
So I mean, so first, a couple things to notice here. The Talmud, which I think it's fair to say that the general attitude of the Talmud is on the side of Shimon, because there are principles of interpretation, there are principles of debate, there's principles of discussion. We see constant dispute and interpretation and argumentation over halakhic practices. But what's amazing is that it includes this story, right? And I shouldn't say that. What's amazing about the Talmud is it includes this story. The Talmud includes these kinds of stories all the time. What do I mean by these kinds of stories? Stories that call into question
their own institutions,
their own presuppositions. And, what's the point of doing that? Well, these kinds of stories do a couple of things. One thing is Shimon is reminded, and the reader is reminded, that there is, to quote Hamlet, there's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, right? That there are limitations to the human understanding. One of the things I talk about in my book, I've got this wonderful episode of Eleazar and the Ugly Man, right? He's riding along on an ass, and he's, he thinks that, oh, I'm so great, I'm a Talmudic scholar and so forth, and runs into an ugly man, and he says, is everyone from your village this ugly? And the ugly man says, I don't know. Why don't you go ask my maker? Why don't you ask the guy who made me, right? And it sort of shocks him, right? He actually learns Torah from this guy, right? This anonymous man, and he's brought up short. He's like, there's an induced humility in this case. This is one of the things about Judaism, by the way. I mean, it's the same Bible that lays out very clearly, right? You adhere to the law, you walk in my ways, and so forth. You're going to get rain, you're going to get fruit. It's all going to be, and not if not. It has the book of Job. I mean, this is really amazing that, so Judaism has, I would call this a philosophical element, right? In other words, never forget that you are a human being, and that as smart as you are and as learned as you are, you have to be humble because you cannot understand everything. At the same time, of course, the Talmud celebrates, the majesty of intellect, right? So I'm thinking of Soloveitchik's famous article on, majesty and humility. Mm-hmm. And there's something like that in Socrates too, by the way, because Socrates is going around and saying, and this is very paradoxical, I am the wisest human being. You know why? Because I know that I'm not wise. And so is he humble or is he arrogant? It's very interesting paradoxes. Kierkegaard says somewhere, incidentally, that the paradox is the passion of thought. And a thinker without a paradox is like a lover without passion. Right? And I think that's right. I think that applies to Judaism. I think it applies to Plato. It's these contradictions. So here's another contradiction that you mentioned, Ben-Sion. The Gemara turns Honi into a rabbi. Yeah. In fact, the later part of the story, which is really sort of tragic, it goes on to talk about Honi, and you almost might say, this is not quite fair. If I were going to put it really strongly and from the point of view of a maybe excessively critical person, I'd say the Gemara gets its revenge on Honi, because what happens is, right, and it gets its revenge on Honi in a way that shows that he's not like he doesn't lead anywhere. Well, first of all, he's an isolated guy, right? Here's this Honi. He doesn't fit into the framework of Shimon. And I think the circle around him kind of almost is a suggestion of how cut off he is. Yes. Because, how do you, so here's a question. How can a person whose excellence, if you will, or whose power consists in a special relationship with God, which nobody can quite understand, have any offspring, intellectual offspring? Is there a future for that kind of person, right? Now, the thing is, in Rabbinic Judaism, there's always a future, because you have houses of study, and you have traditions, and people can learn, and they can become expert in these things, and they can become rabbis, and they can pass it on from their teacher, to the next teacher. How do you teach miracle working, if you see what I'm saying? Right? You don't. So the Gemara does a couple things. It turns him into a sage, maybe because it's a little bit uncomfortable with him. Maybe there's an irony here. I'm not sure what. But Honi, it says he always worried about this verse that in the Bible about comparing the exile in Babylonia to 70 years of sleep, right? It's like, how could you sleep for 70 years? And he's sort of miraculously put to sleep for 70 years. But before that, he runs into a guy who's planting a carob tree. And he's like, why are you planting a carob tree? The fruit from this tree, it takes decades to get anything to eat from it. Carob was a very big source of nutrition in, ancient Palestine. And I'm not sure it's particularly good, but it was a main source of food. And the guy says, yeah, I'm not going to eat it, but my grandchildren will. Which sort of suggests that Honi kind of doesn't understand. Right? Lador Vador. I mean, you got future generations. You need to.
He's removed from the world in a sense.
Yes, yes. And so he falls asleep for 70 years, and he wakes up, and he goes to the Beit Midrash, right? And they're talking about Honi, right? They're like, in the days of Honi, this would all be clear. He would explain everything and so forth, which of course is bizarre because, according to Mishnah, he's not a sage. He doesn't, So Honi's like, I'm Honi, right? And they don't believe him. Like, he's sort of, cut off. And then he dies, right? So what's going on here? The suggestion is that Honi is, he's sort of a one-off. There isn't a future. He's not going to make okay, they'll talk about maybe, his decisions and so forth, but there's a sort of a sad end note here, which is that unlike these rabbis, Honi is not, there's no kind of spiritual fruitfulness that's going to endure and inform the lives of later people. At least that's sort of how I look at it.
It's very similar to the story of Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, in the Torah, where he is this zealous person for God, and he's going by the book, but essentially his miracles are not. He's being told by the king, this is going to last for a little bit of time. This magic that you're doing, whatever it is, it's just going to impact the people for a very short period of time. And at the end, God critiques him and says, this approach that you have of theatrics and everything like that, it's not going to work. You need to use a kol demamad dakah. You need to use a soft, still voice, and that something that can be passed on, basically. And eventually, he's replaced by Elisha, who basically fixes all the mistakes that Eliyahu makes, and he's kind of seen as like a cautionary tale, Eliyahu Navi. Whereas, we see kind of the same thing with Honi. Honi is this, miracle worker who cannot it's not sustainable for the future. It's not going to be passed on.
Yeah, that's right. And so this actually sort of points in a couple of directions. I mean, I see something similar going on in the story of the Oven of Akhnai, which your listeners probably know a lot about, but basically I'll just very briefly say it's a fantastic story. The rabbis at the Rabbinical Academy at Yavne are debating the purity of an oven. And Rabbi Eliezer, who, by the way, the stories about Eliezer are just like, this guy was the top guy. I mean, he, and actually one of the stories, I can't remember where it's drawn from, his father didn't want him to study. His father was a rich man, and he goes and he studies, and then he sort of become, and then his father comes to Jerusalem to visit him, and his father finds out, oh, this guy is respected by all the rich people, and he's regarded as a great sage.
They moved him to the front. I think they moved him to the front so that his father can see him with all the rich people.
Yes, right.
I believe that they kind of set it up for that. Yeah.
Right. And so then the father, who had disinherited him, was like, I'm gonna, you're my guy. He sort of reconciles with him. I'm gonna give you my inheritance, so forth. And Honi's like, to sum up very briefly, it's like, well, actually, I don't need any of that, he sort of positions himself as like, my real father is God, something like this. Another, there's a father, something. But anyway, so here's Eliezer, he's the top guy, and they're debating it. And by the way, it's a very interesting argument that Eliezer is making, but his side is actually quite, sort of from a practical perspective, it's a good position, because the side of the rabbis is that the oven that has been rendered impure is completely impure. And these communal ovens were expensive, and you'd have to like rebuild the whole oven. And Eliezer has this position that like ovens come in these parts, and if one part is rendered impure, you could replace that. And so it's less expensive and so forth. But the rabbis, they don't agree. So Eliezer, it says he gave all the arguments in the world. And by the way, they're probably really good arguments, because he's the top guy. He knows, he's the greatest Talmudic scholar around. And finally, Eliezer says, let me show you. If my position is right, let the carob tree jump. And the carob tree jumps like 50 meters or something. And basically the rabbis are like, that's irrelevant. We want an argument. You gave us a miracle. How does your ability to perform that miracle persuade us of the correctness of your position? Right? We're playing the intellectual game we are playing is argumentation. You make an opinion, you back it up with arguments. You didn't back it up with arguments, you backed it up with a miracle. That's in effect what they're saying, I think. And then at some point, it's like, let the stream flow backwards. Stream flows backwards. Let the study house walls fall. And the walls, out of respect for Eliezer, they fall halfway, but they stop, which is actually really terrible, because if they had fallen, he would have killed all the other rabbis and maybe himself. But anyway, so finally a bat kol comes, a voice from God, and says, why don't you agree with Rabbi Eliezer? Because he's always right on matters of halakha. And one of the rabbis stands up and says to God, it is not in heaven, which the rabbis interpret to mean, you gave us the Torah. We have our own system here where we examine the Torah, we reflect, we use all of our intelligent capabilities to understand what it means. And actually, God, you're not part of this debate. And then God, it says, then Elijah went to God, and God said, my children have bested me. My children, this is again the father, son, the children thing. Now, what does this mean? Well, it connects with Greek philosophy too, because in Aristotle's Politics, he says, if you have someone who is absolutely outstanding in virtue, you either need to make him king or you have to ostracize him. Got to get rid of him. And what the rabbis did there is they didn't challenge the view that Eliezer was right. In fact, my own intuition is they probably thought he was right. They just wanted to pick a fight. Because if Eliezer is around and he's got this special sort of connection with God, okay, what are the other rabbis doing? They're just going to have to obey whatever he thinks. They're completely irrelevant. So it's a way the community sort of stands up for its own existence as a community of rational interpretation and debate. It stands up for itself. Almost, you might put it this way: as long as Eliezer's around, we're just children compared to him. but we want to engage in the adult activity, which all Jews are called to, of thinking for themselves, of studying Torah, of determining the truth, right? Of giving it to their best effort. And if Eliezer is around or anybody like him, we can't do that. So there's a kind of rebellion, a sort of rationalist rebellion. And then, by the way, they excommunicate Eliezer and all kinds of bad stuff happens because he causes miracles to sort of get back at them. But the same thing happens with regard to Socrates, because as I said, Socrates has a special relationship with the God in some way. And the same questions arise that have to do with Honi. Can Socrates, is that special relationship with God somehow involved in his ability or inability to produce students? There is, let me connect it with Honi this way and then I'll stop. In the Phaedo, the dialogue where Socrates dies, he's been sentenced to death and he's drinking hemlock, which is a horrible poison. And his students begin crying and they say to him, Socrates, what are we going to do without you? How will we philosophize? What will we do? And I've always thought Socrates must have been very disappointed at that, because his whole effort was to help people mature, be independent thinkers, be capable of argumentation and discourse and debate and philosophize for themselves. And here they are like little children saying, without you, we can't go on, right? And there really is an interesting question. By the way, I mentioned I wrote a book on Kierkegaard and Socrates. Kierkegaard basically has this critique of Socrates. The philosophic life can set you on the right path and can help you to live well and so forth if you're Socrates, right? If you are the kind of person who lives up to his best understanding. If you have tremendous intelligence, you figure things out on your own and you live up to your best understanding. You put your thoughts into action. There's no split between your speech and deed. You're an integrated whole human being, a wholesome human being. But unfortunately, the rest of us aren't like Socrates, right? So this question of the reproducibility of, say, a good life through Socratic inquiry is also challenged, I think, in the dialogues.
Yes. Actually, I once heard a comedian, Gary Gulman, Jewish comedian, who said that, the Greeks gave us Aristotle, Plato, and all these amazing things. And since then, they've given us Greek salad and Yanni. That was his joke. And what I always wondered was, like, why wasn't that sustainable for all time, the way, let's say, like Jerusalem was, and the wisdom of the sages actually rescued Judaism from being obliterated, and is actually getting stronger and stronger in a way, whereas the Greeks are, their influence isn't as strong. And actually, you kind of answered that question now with Socrates, because it's not easy to pass down something like that. It's not ingrained into the layman. It's not given to the people. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Oh, no, I think this is absolutely right, Ben. Look, the ground was well prepared within the Jewish tradition. I mean, the Torah is read aloud from the days of Ezra. The Jews are the traditions give a very strong support for the idea that Jews are to study Torah, the words of Torah to be in their mouth. They're supposed to understand it. It is ritualistically read and studied throughout the year, the cycle. They placed great emphasis on scholarly excellence, right? And so, you had this ground for a kind of general acknowledgement of the importance of these individuals we call rabbis, who are, let's say, more devoted even to study than the common man. What's the situation with Socrates? Well, it's a really difficult position that he's in, because the Greek, he's a philosopher, and the philosophers were viewed not without reason, by the way, in some sense, as kind of dangerous, and they're not really part of the city. They're engaged in this activity that makes little sense to the common man. Right? What is this quest for wisdom? What are we talking about? Philosophy is not ingrained, and has never been ingrained, and probably will never, in sort of the DNA of human communities, right? Mm-hmm. And Socrates has a terrible problem. In the Apology, the most famous thing he says there, he says, I'm not going to stop philosophizing. Why? And he says, because the unexamined life is not worth living, right? A life in which you don't examine and reflect and philosophize is not worth living. He's got a serious problem. It's because he's talking to an audience of people who do not examine life. That the unexamined life is not worth living is certainly no proof that people can't lead unexamined lives. They do it all the time, right? People don't particularly think for themselves. Bertrand Russell said something like, people would rather die than think for themselves, and they do, right? Mm-hmm. Like they die, So how do you, it's almost like if I said to you, so suppose I learned a really difficult and esoteric, like let's say I played the harp, okay? And I said to people, look, my conviction is that a life without the capacity to play the harp on an excellent level, expert level, is not worth living. Well, why would I, as a non-harpist, believe that? The only way I might be led to believe that is if I devoted my life to becoming an excellent harp player, right? And then I could say, okay, now I know that he was wrong or whatever, right? Or he was right. So how do you convince somebody of the importance of these things? And it's much easier in Judaism. Plato's trying to jumpstart a whole culture, right? I'm going to make a new hero. He's called Socrates, a philosophical hero. I want people to look up. I want people to understand that there's a kind of transcendent realm of divinity and truth and goodness and justice and so forth, and focus on that and bring that into their lives. This is a huge problem. By the way, the Christians love, Plato, because you can sort of fit this into it, right? This idea of transcendence, and that there are eternal truths and so forth, and that, but so what they do is they just replace the good, which is the highest principle, right, of Socratic eros, Socratic longing, Socratic desire, with God, right? Mm-hmm. But Christianity is a religion, right? So you develop these practices, people go to church, they worship in congregations, it spreads, and now you've got some kind of soil. By the way, this, I think, is why, if you look at American universities and you say, well, where are people really serious about philosophy? And again, I'm setting aside the Jewish world, right? But let's just take it's the Catholic universities that still maintain a kind of serious interest in and teaching in and scholarship in the philosophical tradition. And why is that? And what philosophical tradition? Well, particularly like ancient philosophy and, medieval and so forth, and things that are kind of compatible with, let's say, a general Catholic view of the world or something. It's because they've already got the soil, right? If you go to someone and you say, well, you're a Christian, and by the way, here's some texts that are actually sort of in harmony with what we're doing here, and by the way, the church fathers understood them and read them, and they critiqued them and so forth, so we're going to study them. But that's it, right? And the secular world is neither philosophical nor religious. The soil's not there.
Sort of materialist in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a tricky and it's a difficult conundrum. How do you integrate philosophy with the common man? How do you do that? Or what's the answer to that? Because anybody who has delved into philosophy or has even a small philosophical bone knows that it's vital, right, to humanity, to advancing, to all the good, right? Yet it's very difficult. It's very difficult to translate that to the common man. So it's kind of like, I don't know if there's really an answer, or what would be your answer if you could, if you had the podium?
Yeah, well, we would have to revise the entire educational system.
That's really where it goes down to. Yeah.
Look, we are very fortunate today in that we have behind us millennia of truly rich and great books. Starting with the Hebrew Bible. It is, and then we have this commentary on the Hebrew Bible called the New Testament, right? Which is also very interesting. And, you know, these things give rise, but then that, and in connection with the ancient Greek roots and then the sort of Roman appropriation of that, generates really serious reflection on moral and political and social issues, gives a very interesting perspective. There's a lot of work to be done in sort of comparing origin tales, especially interpreted philosophically, of the Greeks, right? And comparing that with the Bible and so forth. And then this gives birth to, incidentally, I mean, great literature. I mean, you could look. I always tell students, you know, if I teach secular students, say something from the Bible, I say, how many of you want to be writers? They raise their hand. You want to write fiction? Okay. All the stories are in the Bible. You got to read the Bible. You know, you want to understand, like, in other words, you want to understand human nature, human beings, human longings, human conflicts, political issues. This is a source of political wisdom. This is a source of spiritual wisdom. You've got to read the Bible. No great author doesn't know the Bible, you know, Shakespeare and so forth. But we don't, what I want to, I mean, the punchline is we don't study this stuff. Or if we do, we bring to it this kind of theoretical matrix of, like, you know, political correctness or diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever it may be. You already know what's in the books. I can already tell you we're reading this. Who is it? Thomas Jefferson. Slave owner. This is the lens we're going to read this through, right? And to be able to, like, okay, why is it? If you look at 19th, 20th century, and you look at real pioneers, right, in like groundbreaking thought, you know, in sociology and psychology and, you know, all kinds of areas, they're often Jews who grew up in traditional homes, right? And the capacities, I sort of think of it this way, this incredible idea that, as Ben Bogbog says, turn it and turn it, for everything is in it, right? That the Torah contains all wisdom, produces it sets an incredible emphasis on the skills of interpretation, on creative thinking, on understanding. And those skills are what made, you know, like, if you say, well, why do Jews win so many Nobel Prizes and so forth? It's in the DNA. It's these skills of saying, this text deserves the greatest seriousness, and I'm going to think about it and study it and appropriate it and interpret it. And when it doesn't work out the way I'm hoping for, I'm going to find clever techniques of interpretation. By the way, of course, there's a kind of there are parameters on that, because if I go too far off, no one's going to care what I say, right? Because there are rules and principles, as you pointed out earlier, for interpretation. So working within a certain framework and squeezing every last drop of meaning out of this text, that's an incredible training for intellectual activity. We don't teach students to do that. How many students come to a text and say, this text is worthy of reverence? Okay, if you're in a yeshiva, of course. But if you're in a public school in the United States, is Huckleberry Finn worthy of reverence? Is the Bible worthy? They're not going to even read the Bible. Is Plato worthy? They're not going to read Plato. So we have to start introducing really meaningful and rich works to students and saying, rule one, approach this with interpretive charity and generosity, and believe that these words are deeply meaningful, and now try to understand what they mean. And only then will we criticize.
The mistake people make is that they think that if let's say they were not born in a religious atmosphere or a religious family, that the Bible doesn't have to be taken seriously for them. That's the huge mistake.
Yeah.
That's not true. In fact, that's literally almost every great thinker in human history has taken it seriously without even being Jewish.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
That's exactly right. And in fact, what's so weird is, let's say we were speaking to a kind of a progressive someone on the far left or something. And what I'd like to say to some of them is, and incidentally, they're, atheistic and like, oh, Christianity, they're ready to, they won't maybe attack Islam, but Christianity, I want to say to them, but actually what your entire framework is a kind of decayed secularized Christianity. Here you come and you say to me, if we just make this, so we care about justice, we care about equity. Okay, first of all, these are sort of, moral categories that it's come down from Christianity. But then you say, okay, we're going to create a heaven on earth. It's a kind of utopia. If we just change this, if we just make things more equitable, if we just do this, we can enter into a kind of more utopian society and so forth. I'm like, this is just some and incidentally, the whole notion of like, we're the true believers, right? And we're pure. Those people are impure. They're sinful. We, because they have white skin or whatever it may be, right? And so all of this is just a translation of this inheritance, and they have no understanding of any of this. This is
they're also reading into all of these things, even the Bible or Thomas Jefferson, as you mentioned, with a modern lens. So they're taking you completely out of the context.
Yes,
what was going on, and that's also very dangerous, because you need to learn from history. You need to understand what it was all about.
Context.
And context is very, very important. And what I think is what Bensi was talking about before about building societies based on, let's say, philosophy and rationalism. Even the Jews, who are quote unquote irrational, who are, let's say, more mystically oriented, they still have the Talmudic framework for living and thinking. So they still are essentially immersed in a rational world in some strange way.
Right. And if it's the case, to go back to this notion of the halakhic conscience, or the sort of ethos of Judaism, that's got to be transmitted through a way of life. There are sort of versions of this. Well, one thing that we don't really do is, I guess I would call, sort of intellectual apprenticeship. I mean, sometimes people think like, I can read these books, I understand everything. But if you're going to be really serious about, let's say, doing history, right? Like, what is historical evidence? How can I assess it and so forth? You got to study with a really good historian. And what you learn from that person are modes of thinking and approaching questions and so forth that you really can't get out of a book. But that's just a sort of relationship between one individual and another. Now, if you have a whole community that is reinforcing these lessons and is bringing children up from an early age and sort of, they're being acculturated in a very significant and rich way, that then transmits this ethos. And so I think Plato was trying to, again, produce a curriculum that would hopefully generate a sort of community, a sort of philosophical community that would then produce a sort of ethos that could then be transmitted through the generations. It didn't happen. Okay. And I think it's just too much. I mean, you have to have a kind of religious basis. It's not enough to just sort of say, I can imitate Socrates, because people won't.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Before we go, first of all, we want to thank you so much for your time, because this was so eye-opening and amazing. But before you go, we want to hear if you have anything you want to plug, book that has come out or is coming out.
Are you working on anything?
Well, right now what I'm working on is I'm helping to start this new university called the University of Austin, which is here in Austin, Texas. And it's dedicated to freedom of inquiry, freedom of discourse, freedom of conscience. I'm the director of the Intellectual Foundations program here, which is a liberal studies program. So, for example, we have courses in the beginning of civilization. We read Genesis, we read the Odyssey. We have courses in the beginning of politics. We read Exodus. We read Herodotus and so forth. So I'm trying to really begin rooting it right in the great biblical and ancient Greek texts, and we go through the Western tradition, and this is essentially a startup. I mean, we've been raising lots of money and so forth, so I haven't had a chance to be working on any books. I've turned to writing on literature, written probably 8 essays now for the New Criterion on things like, latest one was on the Brothers Karamazov. I've written on literature in the Soviet period. I'm sort of focused on totalitarianism now, and kind of sussing out the let's say the increasingly hardening ideological domination of politics and so forth. So I've been doing short essays. If readers are interested in Plato, I would direct them to my last book, which already now is 5 years old. In 2018, I wrote a book called Glaucon's Fate: History, Myth, and Character in Plato's Republic. And I'm actually very proud of that book. It's the second book I've written on the Republic. And it gives you, I think, a very rich sense of both the historical context and of Socratic philosophizing and some of the mistakes that Socrates made. It's actually about the fate of Plato's brother Glaucon, who is one of the main interlocutor of Socrates in the Republic. And my argument is that Socrates could not save him for a life of philosophy and justice, that Glaucon actually joined this regime of Plato's relatives called the 30 Tyrants. So it was a sort of spectacular failure. So anyway, that's what
one more thing about the school, University of Austin. So I'm assuming, like, based on what you said, that you're trying to kind of get people back to the classics, and avoid a lot of the trends that you see over around universities, where there's a lot of political influence in terms of how we understand things, what we're learning, what children are being indoctrinated with rather than being educated with. What's kind of gone away is, our educators teaching us how to think and not what to think. So is that something that you guys are really fighting for?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, if you think about the philosophical ethos, like what is it like to be a philosopher? What is it like to be a rabbi? That requires practical wisdom. It requires sound judgment. And that's one of the things that I really want to present to the world about our school. We want students to be able to bring together the best of tradition with the sort of best ideas of the present, and to take that understanding that they've developed and bring it out into the world. And I would say I want to advertise us as a place that actually strives to develop both the sort of ordinary virtues of like intellectual courage, right, and humility, and I think other virtues, moral virtues that are associated with that, moderation and so forth, but especially this idea of prudence. If you look at our world today, the thing that's lacking is good judgment. I mean, we've got people in all our institutions. And there's a whole long story here about perhaps the way that modernity wants to replace judgment with kind of algorithms and procedures and kind of, rules and principles and so forth. So how do you develop good judgment? You try to see things whole, right? You try to connect experience across multiple domains of human experience and different approaches. And it seems to me that to be a flourishing citizen in the world today, we have to start at the beginning. We have to be informed by these great books of wisdom. We have to see how that wisdom was appropriated or failed to be appropriated as we move through the ages. Part of this is involved with, like, look, when we study a text at the University of Austin, we're not going to tell the students, oh, by the way, this is a book that you should all condemn because its author was a racist or something like that. Well, why are we studying it? No. Here's the words on the page. Respect it, understand it, discuss it, debate it. And like the Talmud, multitude of opinions are plausible as long as you can. Here's the rule: you can give me your opinion, right? It has to be pertinent to the discussion, but as long as you're willing to have it examined and you're willing to back it up with arguments. So that kind of rationalism, I think, it's
that reminds me of Maimonides. It says, accept the truth from whoever says it. Instead of trying to see who said something, try to understand what's being said.
Yes.
Something that
not from whoever says it, but accept truth for wherever source it comes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but yeah, the same idea.
Is said.
Exactly.
Accept truth by what is said, not who said it.
Exactly.
Yes. And I think today, since we're so divided, we look and we say, oh, this was said by somebody who I am predisposed to regard as,
Throw them out.
Throw them out. You can't do it.
Yeah.
So
we dedicated a few podcasts actually to like certain segments to do we throw away the art from the artist if the artist happened to be like, let's say, like a Bill Cosby or somebody like that. So what do we do with that? So it's a very important thing, and
that's
I really
actually the Elisha ben Avuya story in the Talmud.
Oh,
that's really what the question they're posing. Rubenstein, who we're actually going to have on to actually present that entire aggadah, his entire understanding of that story is exactly that. That
I'm going to have to tune in.
Can you accept truth from someone who did not exemplify exceptional character, right? And in his case, he was a sinner. He was an apostate.
Yes.
That's how he understands the story of Elisha ben Avuya and what the Talmud is presenting to us, this conundrum. So it just flowed with what you said. So
that's excellent.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And there one last thing before we go. Yeah. I did notice somewhere when I was looking at some of your bios, you wrote an essay on theologies regarding the theologies on the Holocaust.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go look. I have written on that subject, but I'm not sure which essay you're referring to. So yeah.
I was just thinking that perhaps maybe down the line, if you'd ever want to do it again, maybe that could be a topic, since you've written about it. That we
it could discuss. Be. Yes, it could be. I've certainly taught that material, and it's boy, you talk about big questions. Oh
yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I will have to gird my loins if we do that. So, but hey, listen, this has been really delightful. It's exceeded my expectations completely, being able to talk with you guys, and I'm going to have to listen to the Jeffrey Rubenstein because that sounds fascinating. So
I actually think the Rubenstein episode that we did before, and even the episode we did with Professor Len Goodman, right up your alley.
Len is a good friend of mine, and he's fantastic. I have the greatest respect for him. So, great. Well, thank you.
We're gonna have him on again, by the way, too, to talk about his book on justice. But it's such a hard book. It's taking
Well, that's the only kind of book he writes, But he's absolutely amazing. Yeah. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Okay. Have a wonderful week. Thank you.